Good day. My name is Glenn O'Kray, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of Through the Arsenal Gates. I have the pleasure of introducing people who have made history, are making history, and will make history. Today we have a special guest, Chris Merlo. He's a wonderful person who's a writer, a speechwriter, an editor, and a decent human being. Chris.
Well, thank you, Glenn.
Tell us about where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in Redford Township. My parents are both were Dearbornites. They went to Fordson High School, got married at St. Alphonsus Church, and then followed Father Stromsky out to the suburbs or Redford Township when he went to St. Robert Bellarmine. So, and that's where I went to grade school. So, but I'm happy to say I'm back in Dearborn for the last 35 years, and I'm like a third generation Dearbornite.
And you went to college at?
Well, actually two places. I went to Wayne State, started off there, and then I transferred over to U of M Ann Arbor.
Okay.
So, and I studied art history and English at those universities. And then later on, I also went to College for Creative Studies to study copywriting and art direction.
All right,
so,
very good. And I forgot that most important high school you went to.
University of Detroit Jesuit High School,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
Who was your most influential person when you were growing up?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think we have most important people through different life stages that we go through, right? I mean, certainly at a young age, my parents, but I would say in high school it was Father Polakowski. We called him Polo. He was an English teacher and creative writer teaching.
When you were 12 years old, what did you think you wanted to do for a living?
Good question. We had an assignment, and I was either 6th or 7th grade, to write our autobiography. So at that time, in my autobiography, I wrote that I was either going to be a naturalist, an architect, or a journalist. So I hit on one of those. I'm a writer, so journalist, but I still have a deep interest, as you well know, with our book, in architecture, and I also, love nature. So.
Very good. What is your philosophy of life, Chris?
Well, at U of D, the motto there is "Men for Others," and so that's kind of a guiding principle for the students who go to school there. But I also think it's important to be thankful for all that you have, to express gratitude, to work hard. That's important, and to be curious. So
very good. And your values?
Be kind, be honest, compassionate, and really emphasize the importance of family and friends.
Now, tell us about some of the jobs that you've had through the years.
Well, my first job was door-to-door salesman. So I was still in high school selling aluminum door cleaner, door-to-door. So, and then after college, I became a journeyman painter. I was working in construction. Then I got into the communications business. So.
And like doing what in the communications business?
Well, I'm a writer, so but I work in corporate communications. I write videos, I write executive speeches, a wide variety of communications.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have to admit that Chris and I have been involved in editing this wonderful book, Stories from the Sidewalk, a walk through 137 years that shaped Dearborn, 1833 to 1970. Chris, tell us about this.
Well, actually, the genesis of this book starts with Glenn, because I happened to walk by his house one day and we struck up a conversation, and he asked me to get involved with the history group. But really, the genesis of this book goes back to almost 1999, when residents in the Morley area neighborhood association wanted to document the historical homes in their neighborhoods, all in an effort to have that area designated as a historic district.
I'm usually involved in grunt work and I carry my load. But Chris and I admitted to the fact that one of us was going to do more work than the other. He did more than 50%.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm very pleased to have passed the torch on that.
You're being way too gracious here. I mean,
Now,
I think between all of us, I mean, Glenn and our team and everything, I mean, we're looking at somewhere in the area, I would have to estimate 5,000 hours into this particular book.
yeah. It took us 3 years to piece this book together, and it's just a wonderful book. It's available at the museum. It's available at the Dearborn Administrative Center, at the Framery, at the Black Box Gallery, at the Dearborn Shop. So it's at your fingertips, and it's probably the best deal in the world. It'll only cost $35 for you. Now, I have to acknowledge the researchers that were involved in this, without whom we would not be here today. Maria Fogarasi, Nancy Harmon, Karen Milligan, Sharon Morton, Rebecca Pavey, Liz Podges, Ian Tomaszek, and then Chris and myself. Chris, tell our audience the process that our researchers went through in putting this together.
It was laborious, to say the least. And, talking about literally putting your nose to the grindstone, each of these researchers spent countless hours either online researching, and we were at the time going through the pandemic, so they either go to the museum archives or through the Benson archives, starting from scratch in many of these cases, which was basically looking up the house in city directories, going through old newspaper clippings perhaps. And there was documentation on these homes as well in the Dearborn Historical Archives. And then, basically assembling all of their notes or their stories on each of these houses. Because our premise from the book was every house has a story to tell, or every historical building has a story to tell. And thus the name of the book, Stories from the Sidewalk. So people would go, our researchers would research each of these historic resources, we call them. They're houses or buildings that are at least 50 years old, and then assembled all of that data and then handed it over to Glenn and myself. Glenn and I split up our responsibilities. Glenn handled the Arsenal District. I handled the Riverbend District, as well as the researchers did the same thing. They sort of concentrated on those individual districts. And then Glenn and I proceeded to put together and edit this book. It's over almost 100,000 words, 379 pages, and we probably went through at least, I would have to say, at least 9 revisions on the book in terms of reviewing it, editing it, and just making sure it was right.
One of the great things in this book that Chris had suggested and did was compiling a section called What, Who, and Where. This is masterful. I've never seen another book like this. Chris, tell us about it.
We can all look at individual houses and say, okay, this house, belonged to the sister of Henry Ford. And that is an individual story on a house, right? But once Glenn and I began to assemble these stories, we began to just see trends that occurred in either of these historic districts, in Riverbend or the Arsenal District. And, we started to see the big picture. And so at that point, I thought, rather than having a traditional index, we called the section What, Who, and Where. And it basically lists residents of these 2 neighborhoods by either association with the Ford family or friends of the Ford family, city leaders, first-generation executives from Ford Motor Company, second-generation executives from Ford Motor Company, farmers, and then architects and builders that built or designed the houses or buildings in the 2 districts. And with some really fascinating findings. There's somewhere in the area of 59 different architects, builders that worked on these homes built these homes, something in the area of 61 farmers, who many of who sold their property to Ford Motor Company and then decided to build a house or live in either of these two neighborhoods. In addition, their descendants stayed in these neighborhoods as well. So just remember, back at this time, we're talking the early teens and 20s of the 19th or 20th century, that there were no freeways. So basically, people didn't travel far to go to work or travel far from family. So basically, we're talking about a community, and then looking at it from the big picture, seeing what the fabric of that community was in terms of relationships between people as well as their professions.
One other tidbit about this section that Chris is talking about is there's a section on heroes. Coincidentally, this past week I was watching public TV, and there was a show on Dale Carnegie heroes. And one of the Dale Carnegie heroes lived in the Morley Area Residents Association. So it was neat. There are only a handful of people that are chosen each year for this designation, and we're fortunate enough to have had one of those folks living in our neighborhood. Now, we're going to go through this book, and Chris and I have both selected different homes that we're going to talk about. And one of the interesting things is that it was very hard for me, anyhow, to talk about a specific home because all the homes really had pretty good stories. I'm going to say probably 80% had wow stories in back of them. These homes and other buildings are between Michigan and Cherry Hill, Brady, and for the sake of simplicity, Outer Drive. They're at least 50 years old. First one, the Baldwin Bryant Brubaker House, which is on Garrison, just adjacent to the Dearborn Towers. Very interesting home. It is a California craftsman bungalow, and the builders were Frank Henry and William Fox. William Fox, coincidentally, is the grandfather of a classmate of mine from Sacred Heart, Elaine Jansen Wilson. The home was built in 1914. The property was originally owned by the Haig family, and the Haig family property had been owned by Joshua Howard, the first commandant at the arsenal beforehand. Stephen Baldwin bought the property. He was a wealthy Detroit businessman. He owned a large farm south of Dearborn Township. He had a nephew by the name of Leroy James Baldwin, who purchased a kit home, the La Vitello model from the Lewis Manufacturing Company in Bay City. And there was every conceivable upgrade to this home. The builders had had a hand in the construction of several other homes and also had a hand in building the dam by the Fairlane Estate and the Leroy Bryant House. Eva Bryant, who lived here, was the sister of Clara Bryant, and Clara Bryant, of course, married Henry Ford. Her husband, George Brubaker, worked at the Henry Ford tractor plant as well as the Rouge complex. The following owner was George Belding. He was a World War I vet, and he was involved in several Dearborn commissions. He wrote a book of poetry, and he had actually several poems published. His major work was Tales from the Presque Isle Woods, and it's about the lumberjack days in northern Michigan. Some of his poetry appeared alongside of that of Carl Sandburg, so he was a significant poet. Chris, you're on.
Well, I cheated, Glenn. You asked me to select a house, and I kind of went counter to what you asked, because my first selection is 4 homes, and it kind of builds off again what we talked about with the index and the what, who, and where, and the fact that so many farmers who sold property to the Ford Motor Company or to Henry Ford built homes or took up residence in either of these two neighborhoods. So there's a section on military just between the bridge across the Rouge River and Cherry Hill on South Military, and there are 6 houses in that stretch of military, and 4 of those 6 homes were built or owned by former farmers who sold property, or 3 of them sold property to Henry Ford or the Ford Motor Company. So I call that Farmers Row. And the one house, the John and Anna Oakes house, the Oakes had a farm which is now occupied by the Ford Rouge complex. Their house was built in 1923. And next door neighbor was the Thomas and Augusta Preen house. And Thomas had a farm that stretched from what was called the flats of the Rouge, which is Ford Field and the Toboggan Hill or the Sled Hill there, and it stretched all the way to what is now the Dearborn Country Club. He sold his farm to Henry Ford as well, and the house he lives in, it's at 134 South Military, was built in 1920. A neighbor just south of that house is 330 South Military, and that was George and Mary Granger. The Grangers had a farm in what is now Rouge Park. Their house was built in 1918. And probably the most significant house on the street belonged to Samuel and Anna Long, and that's on the east side of Military there. And specifically, the Long farm became what is now Long Boulevard. That really significant home was built in 1880, and it's an Italianate farmhouse. I believe also it built from brick from the Dort brickyard here, and Titus Dort also supplied brick for the Dearborn Arsenal. So,
Okay, very good. All right, the next house that I'd like to talk about is used as an office building right now. It had been the Dearborn General Hospital on Oakwood and Morley. It is a craftsman bungalow built in 1917. The land at one time had been owned by Arthur Nowlin. It was then sold to David Lapham, who owned appropriately the P.D. Lapham Bank, which was purchased by Henry Ford, and it still remains intact on the corner of Michigan and Mason. It's known today as Comerica. But Henry Ford sold the property to John Daly. Does that name ring a bell? It should. John was one of the 5 sons of William Daly, who was known as Squire Daly. And John had a farm on Gully and Michigan. So this, in effect, was a city home for him. So he was a land baron. He owned 160 acres of farmland before moving here. Now, the first Dearborn General Hospital was at Snow and Monroe. It burned down, so the city gave permission for the hospital to move to Morley and Oakwood. And guess who was born there? That's it. I was born there. So that's why I'm throwing it in this mix. Dr. Carl Radigan went through the process of developing Oakwood Hospital, but he used this as the prime Dearborn Hospital before moving to Oakwood. Dr. Radigan is of note because he has 3 facilities in this book. This very hospital, and then he had his office on Garrison, and he had his home on Law. So, Chris, you're on next.
well, this next house was a real, aha moment that, surprise and delight discovering this house, or not discovering the house, but the occupant of the house. Karen Milligan and I interviewed a neighbor on Alexandrin. He was a 3rd generation to live on Alexandrin at this house. And we were interviewing about the neighborhood, and he said, Thomas Edison's lab assistant lived down the street. And it was like, really? Come on, that's unbelievable. And sure enough, Karen researched the house, and the gentleman's name was Francis Gilles, And Francis was the last surviving lab assistant for Thomas Edison. He was at Thomas Edison's side in 1879 in Menlo Park when the first light bulb was lit. Following that, Thomas Edison sent Gilles into Europe to establish electrical infrastructure to light Europe. So Gilles came back to the United States. Henry Ford at that point was also beginning then to assemble his collection, the Edison Institute, which is today the Henry Ford in Greenfield Village. Henry, being such a huge fan of Thomas Edison, bought Menlo Park and relocated here, as many of you well know, to Greenfield Village. He hired Gilles to help him recreate, as exact as possible, the lab as it was at the time in 1879 and under when it was run by Thomas Edison. So in the, I believe it was called the Golden Jubilee, which was in 1929, 50 years after the lighting of the first light bulb, Thomas Edison, Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States, Thomas and Henry Ford, and Alfred Gilles all convened in the Menlo Park lab at Greenfield Village to recreate the lighting of the first light bulb. So again, Alfred Gilles lived on Alexandrin, and what a surprise and delight that was.
Absolutely. Next home is the Lapham House, which is on the intersection of Morley and Mason. It's a national folk gable front and wing with Second Empire-inspired tower. It was built in 1890, and according to Jack Tate, who is the curator at the Dearborn Historical Museum, it was built with timbers from the arsenal. At one time, it had 6 fireplaces, and it had the first indoor plumbing in Dearborn. The first owner was David Lapham. David owned a bank, appropriately called the Lapham Bank. He sold the home to Andrew and Jean Black, and they got the money for the purchase of that home by selling their farm to Henry Ford for the development of the Fairlane estate. Ed and Millie Bovich bought the home with the intention of fixing it up. They did not want it torn down. There was talk that Mayor Hubbard was going to develop that area, and they wanted to save it from destruction. So at the time that they fixed it up, there were 100 code violations there. Chris, you're on.
Well, the next house I'd like to talk about is, I wrote a story for the Press and Guide. The headline for the story was Mr. Cement Builds a Concrete House. Mr. Cement was a gentleman named Larry Hume, and Mr. Hume was the president of the Peerless Cement Company. Now, this house is really quite unique. Number one, it's at the very end of a long boulevard, and it's built on the ravine, and it overlooks Ford Field. The other really interesting thing about the house is it's built of concrete block. So not many homes, there's a few of them in Dearborn, but built of concrete block. It's probably as solid as a rock, as you would say. Ian Tomasic characterized the house architecturally as English cottage style, and it is quite a charming residence. I mean, I just, every time I walk through the area, I can't help but look at that house and think it's just an incredibly interesting home, and must offer wonderful views of Ford Field, especially on a snowy day like this.
All right, last home I'm going to talk about is the Roy Bryant home, which is on Morley Court. This was built as a wedding gift to Clara Bryant Ford's brother and his wife, Roy Bryant and Catherine Bryant. You say, boy, that name Catherine Bryant sounds familiar. The library on the corner of Michigan and Mason is named after her because she was very important in the early days of the Dearborn Public Library system. So this wedding present was a neat present. The home was built in 1912. It was a two-story craftsman. And again, it was built by Frank Henry and William Fox. Roy Bryant worked as a bookkeeper for the Ford Farms, and Clara Bryant Ford would come to visit by taking her electric boat, the Callie Bee, down the Rouge River and hopping off at Morley Court and coming up to the home to visit. Now, there was a pergola that stretched along the east side of the house at one time, and the family sold it along the way. Several owners lived there. The most current owners are Jim and Sue Hill. One of the unfortunate things about Roy Bryant is that when Mrs. Ford passed away, he sued the estate asking for $10 million, and it left a distaste in the mind of the attorney doing the business here. Chris, you're on for the last one.
Well, the last one is not one, but three homes, actually. Again, it goes back to our earlier discussion about the index and the trends we saw with that, bringing all of the homes together in the book and then developing the index of what, who, and where. So one of the trends that we saw was, again, friends and family of the Fords, Henry and Clara, deciding to live close in the proximity to the Fairlane estate. Another trend was Ford Motor Company executives choosing to live in these two neighborhoods, as well as executives of subsidiaries of Ford Motor Company. And another trend was just family members living together. So, multiple members of one family living in different houses in the two neighborhoods. The family I'm talking about are the Rudimans. Okay, the Rudimans were a family that lived in the Scotch settlement, or where Henry Ford grew up. And the first Rudiman I want to talk about is Edsel Rudiman. He went to school with Henry Ford in the Scotch settlement, and he was also one of Henry Ford's best friends. And because of that, Henry and Clara Bryant Ford named their only son, their only child, after Edsel. So it was Edsel Bryant Ford. Edsel Rudiman lived on Long Boulevard, and his sister-in-law, Margaret Ford Rudiman, lived on River Lane. The house that Margaret lived in was at one time the farmhouse, the Rudiman farmhouse in the Scotch settlement. Henry Ford wanted his sister to have a more secure place to live, and that house, or parts of that house, were deconstructed and then transferred over to River Lane. The gentleman who helped move that house was the same gentleman who helped Henry Ford move buildings into Greenfield Village, and his name was Edward Cutler. So that house was moved in 1941. So he was the sister-in-law of Edsel Bryant and the sister of Henry Ford. And finally, Edsel's son, Stanley Rudiman, who was president of the Detroit, Toledo, and Ironton Railway, which was owned by Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company. And he lived at a beautiful Georgian colonial on River Lane itself. So,
in wrapping this up, Chris, tell us what you want people to say about you when you're gone to the next life.
Never an easy question, Glenn. Thank you. I don't know. Maybe that I'm a good writer. I'm a good friend, a good husband and father.
Very good. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Chris Merlo, the co-editor of this wonderful book. If you enjoyed the program, tell all your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, just keep it to yourself. Thanks for joining us.